Hey everyone, Curse Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted, and this is another episode of Budget Cards from one of the many sets that's come out recently. As you all know, we are inundated with sets. There is a downpour of new cards all the time, so sometimes we might have a hard time looking back and looking for some good cards to put in our budget decks. Now, I'm sure there's a bunch of cards from the set that are not budget friendly that you can put into, some of your stronger decks. I think of the Roaming Throne, even things like Get Lost, there's a lot of stuff. But generally, and I think with this series going forward, I'm much more interested in budget and ultra budget decks. So I'm thinking of cards built for decks that are meant to be around $50 to $100 or have some other kind of specific restrictions, such as how much money per card or something like that, and to help us build those decks. I find that, Magic is an expensive hobby, it's an expensive format no matter what you play, and therefore anything that allows us to build cheaper decks is good, especially those that can make cheaper decks that we thought were just unwinnable or didn't have certain cards more accessible, right? So let's get right into it and see what I've found. If you'd like to take a look at the deck list we're talking about today, or if you'd like to submit your own deck list to me so that I can make a video assisting your deck, please check the video description down below. Let's start with Dauntless Dismantler. This is a 2-mana 1/4 creature that definitely sees play in stronger commander decks, and I think is worthwhile in considering in lower power and budget commander decks too. 1/4 artifacts your opponents control enter the battlefield tapped, and then for X white, sacrifice Dauntless Dismantler, destroy each artifact with mana value X. For those who don't know, something that's really powerful of this with this is the fact that you can use it to blow up a bunch of treasures for just 1 white mana. And I think definitely at lower power levels or, that kind of mid-budget builds, this is going to be a very powerful effect to do. It is not often that you can easily beat the opponent who has 1,000,000 treasure tokens if you allow them to untap with them. Now you might say, well, you can't destroy treasure tokens because they're usually sacrificed, but you can do this timing wise at the right time, on an end step, in a point when they're low on cards or otherwise unable to do anything with that mana. So that alone, I think it's generally good enough, not even including the fact that if they just, summoned a bunch of or created a bunch of treasure tokens, they come in tapped, therefore getting rid of the cost of sacrificing it, like they can't tap them down anyways. Otherwise, this is good for destroying mana rocks, good for destroying key targets and engines. I find a lot of engine cards tend to be at 3 or 2 artifact mana. So at 3, this is tough because it is 7 mana to do that. But at 2, this is very reasonable to pay 5 mana to destroy it. Otherwise, in any form of more defensive decks in metas that there's going to be a lot of treasures or other artifacts, this is a very good card. Moving on, we've got Helping Hand. This is a copy of, kind of Unearth, and though we've gotten other versions of this card with minus or plus the CMC and minus or plus an ability or two, Helping Hand is very straightforwardly reanimating a 3 mana or less creature from your graveyard tapped. Now, this is obviously going to be much better against decks that don't have access to black or Unearth, but want to bring 3 mana cards back. And for that, I think of Blink decks, I think of some Kindred decks, and otherwise, maybe blue-white looting decks, red-white rummaging decks. Give us a lot of ways to use Helping Hand very well. I will even point out that the Helping Hand is probably good in some of those Spellslinger decks, and maybe even Jeskai, the full red, white, blue, because being able to buy back a young Pyromancer or another Magecraft or other kind of spell slinger creature is going to be very useful, and this is just another spell you can cast, which I do like. Something that I think is maybe entering the realm of ultra budget but really interesting, Malamet Warscribe is a card that I do really like in Blink decks. This is definitely a card for the ultra budget, $50 or less, but this is a creature that has an anthem attached to them. And if you can blink them even just once in a turn, is adding, basically 4/2 to your entire board in order for a very lethal attack. I like this a lot. I think in decks that are ultra budget or otherwise trying to maybe do some kind of kindred things with cats or warriors, this can be very, very helpful. I agree, it's not a very, very flashy creature, and 5 mana is quite a bit, but I think at lower power levels and high budgets, this is going to make a pretty good impression of an overrun effect. And it gives you a creature, right? I think that's the main thing, is a lot of these overrun effects are just sorceries that do this, so keeping it on a creature I think is very, very good. Moving on to blue, a very big favorite of mine is Everflowing Well. This is Divination Plus. It's Divination with, I should say, Mill 2, then Draw 2, but then it has extra text, allowing you to flip it on your upkeep if you have 8 permanents, and then it transforms into a land with a pretty decent ability, but generally I think you're happy with just a land. Back in the day, we would think of Simic as being the best color combination in Commander because of the mentality that blue plus green is card draw and ramp. And that, at especially lower powers, is just very, very powerful. Everflowing Well is kind of like that in just one color. That's not even including things about graveyard synergy or the fact that this is an artifact, so you have some artifact synergy. It's legendary, so I'm sure there's something there. It's just generally a very neat package of cards put together that I think is very good, and especially if you are in any form of blink, or any form of recursion of these types, you're going to be very, very happy with this card. So generally, if I would be building on a budget and I was in any of those zones, the Everflowing Well is a card I would consider. Moving right along, Marauding Brinefang is very, very interesting to me. Definitely closer to ultra budget, but also budget reanimator decks. I think as we've gotten more and more reprints of reanimation cards, our reanimator tools have gotten cheaper and cheaper and more accessible. I think Reanimate, for one, is cheaper than it's been in a very, very long time, not including the reprints of Necromancy and Animate Dead, I think, as well, came out recently, all of which bringing them more accessible to other players. However, the thing is that, especially in ultra budget, having a package of a creature and a way to bin that creature is a bit harder. And that's something I like about these cycling cards, is because Troll of Khazad-dûm and the like tend to be really, really powerful because they both put themselves in the graveyard and are a big scary creature. Marauding Brinefang is that for budget decks. Having an island cycling at 2 mana instead of 1 is still really, really good, and a 6/7 Ward 3 is quite a dangerous creature, especially if you can animate them rather cheaply. And nowadays that could be even something like Victimize or something with a finality counter. I think it's very, very accessible, and you'll be excited for this card. Otherwise, if you are in low budget, cycling and things like that, I think this is a very, very good one. It is 2, but I do believe that the Island Cycler from Lord of the Rings is more money and also is not a creature. So Marauding Brinefang has quite a few things on its compatriot, let's say. So I think this is really cool and very accessible. And if you have some kind of dinosaur cycling deck you've been waiting to put together, I guess this is the card for you. Going into black from the main set, we've got Abyssal Gorestalker. This is really interesting to me. Once again, this is definitely a blink style card or a reanimation card that really catches my eye. This is one of those, I'm trying to remember what they're called, but Plague Crafter style cards, where it's a creature that enters the battlefield and asks for a sacrifice across the board. Now, Abyssal Gorestalker is one of the ones that makes it's not just one creature, but it's 2 creatures, which outside of your opponents having token decks is very much so a board clear in its own right? Losing 2 creatures across the board, and if everyone sacks 2, you are getting, a, goodness, what would we call that? 6 for 2? I think that's about right. You sacrifice the 2 weakest creatures you have, you get to keep a 6/6. This is generally very, very good. But if we start combining this in Reanimate, in Blink especially, this becomes a very, very good card. This is also a good ramp card in like cheap, very high budget green, black ramp, and does a very good impression of bigger creatures that have similar effects. If you can repeatedly play this, if you can play this once even, I think you're going to be very, very happy. If you're able to leave the ultra budget zone and go from like $50 decks to $100 decks, I think Abyssal Gorestalker stops being as good, but up until then, I think it is a rather strong card for what it is. Moving on in black, another card that really caught my eye for ultra budget decks is Grasping Shadows. Now, this is kind of a mix of two cards that almost have nothing to do with each other, but both of them are interesting in their own right. Grasping Shadows kind of helps out a semi-mechanic. It's not a real mechanic, we only see it every now and then. It was in OG Innistrad, where it's Black Loner, where you get benefits when either you only have a creature or only one creature attacks. Grasping Shadows version is that whenever a creature you control attacks alone, it gets Death Touch and Lifelink for the turn, and then you get a dread counter on this card. That first bit of text I think is rather good generally, especially if you are playing a budget Voltron deck. Giving your creature lifelink and death touch, especially if they have first strike, but honestly just lifelink and death touch is rather good to ensure that they get through, gain you a little bit of life, and start ticking away at your opponents. But the real benefit is the dread counters, of course. After 3 dread counters, which I think is reasonable to say after 3 turns, including the one you cast this, you get to transform it. Now, honestly, the thing about this is at ultra budget level, I think I'm just happy with just the transform, right? Is that just getting a land for our effort is rather good. Especially like if we are looking to ramp into bigger things, or if we're playing some kind of aggro deck, just being able to turn this into a land is really, really nice. But of course, this also buys you 3 additional cards for the 3 dread counters that you have on this. You remove a dread counter, you pay 1 black, you tap this, you draw a card, and you lose a life. Now that's 2 mana to draw a card and lose a life, which is pretty much, I would say that's pretty much worth a card, 2 mana for a card. It could be better, but if you are an ultra budget, you don't mind. And that's not even including your ability to proliferate these counters. Still, I think this is a nice package of a lot of interesting things, especially in certain decks that you might find really, really interesting to try out. And getting this kind of ramp, especially when you're outside of green and you don't have access to, let's say you don't want to play mana rocks or you want to use something else, it's going to be rather good. One more, and this is a very interesting one, Mephitic Drought is one of our artifacts you might see in Artifact Engine decks, where it has an ETB and a Go into the Graveyard trigger. Now obviously Leaves would be better, but Enters or Goes to the Graveyard is still rather good. And why we like these kind of effects is that this makes these very good either recursion or sacrifice targets, where you play this, immediately sack it, and then if you can recur it later, you get a ton of triggers out of it. Mephitic Drought is very simple. Likewise to the previous card, it is lose a life, draw a card. So it means it immediately replaces itself, and then if you use an engine card or a creature, or it's otherwise removed, you get another card and lose another life, which is putting you positive on cards, which I do really, really like. So if you can think of like Jan Jansen or like other forms of artifact play and recursion, I think this is a rather good card that will be just one of those cards. Like it's just another copy of one of these effects. I know there's a bunch of other ones, like ones that ETB or die will search your library for a land, or will create a treasure token, or just draw a card, and just having an additional copy is going to be rather good. Also, I don't know how much all of those cards cost, so in ultra budget, this might be, one of the few ones you have access to, which can be really rather nice. One more in black that really caught my eye, Soul Coil Viper for a black, tap it, sacrifice it, reanimate a creature with a finality counter, and activate as a sorcery. So let's take a moment to talk about finality counters, because I think they have a very strange rap. I think there's this element that Commander and other Magic players feel that when they see something that tells them they can't do something again, or they can never do something, they kind of get cagey, even if it's something they can't do. Everyone knows the situation with like poison counters. Many, especially newer players, hate poison counters because they bring up the argument that poison counters are permanent. Now you might say, well, they also hate them because it turns your 40 life into 10, which I agree, but that's not always why people don't like it. There's a new card that's coming out in Duskmourn that says some kind of clause that when an opponent is either hit by it or something happens, that player cannot gain life for the rest of the game. I've heard several players who are new complain about this mechanic and say that it is unfun or unfair. So to me, that kind of like you can no longer gain life is very scary to players, even if they do not have a way to gain life in the first place, right? So, talking about finality counters. A finality counter means when the creature dies, it's gone forever. There are ways to get exile back, I know, but generally, for most decks, that creature is gone forever. But I would ask players who feel strongly about that is, how much reanimation do you have? And how often are you going to reanimate the same target several times? And finally, how often, when you play this deck, do your opponents hold out their exile spells specifically for your reanimated targets, right? This is a lot of clause that I think is really relevant, because if you look at this and you don't play a lot of reanimation, you get exiled a lot, you don't reanimate the same creature, whatever, finality counters are really, really good because they allow you to reanimate cards very, very cheaply. Soul Coil Viper is interesting because it itself is not exiled, which certain cards of this kind of type do, which means if you can reanimate the Viper itself, you get to keep doing this effect. And if the creatures that you are playing are good enough that you don't mind the finality counter, you're pretty happy with the result. And finally, if you're in a form of a blink deck of any kind, obviously blinking a creature with a finality counter removes the counter. All of this is really good. There's also, I had to think for a second, there's also the mechanic of taking the finality counter and putting on your opponent's creatures, but that's tricky, especially in budget, so maybe don't worry too much about this. All that to say, in especially ultra budget, at this card you can probably get for 10 cents, I think you're going to be rather happy with its ability. Moving on to red, in the main set we've got Dire Flail. This is a card that I have suggested a lot in other decks, in real decks that don't have budget restrictions, and therefore I am very, very happy with it. Already, a 1 mana +2 for equip 1 is the kind of card I really, really like, especially in very close to the floor aggro, or budget equipment decks, or equipment decks in general. And of course, if you can craft with an artifact preferably that has gone to the graveyard, you get Dire Blunderbuss, which is way, way better. Not only is this just very good for increasing the damage from power from +2 to +3, you also have this massive gain where you can trade your artifacts for your opponent's creatures. And that creature, like, you deal damage in terms of the total power, including the bonus of the creature that's equipped with the Blunderbuss, which generally, if you equip even like a 2/2, that's 5 damage, and all you have to do is attack with it and sacrifice an artifact. So your treasure tokens, your map tokens, your blood tokens, whatever tokens you have lying around become, well, I guess cannonball fodder, right? I think that's the whole joke about this. And then you are killing off your opponent's creatures for resources you either can make easily or no longer need. You can trade your mana rocks for your opponent's commander. I think that's rather good. Don't get me wrong, crafting with artifact isn't cheap. 5 mana is very much so, and it is a payment, like it's not free. But if you think of this as 6 mana, destroy your opponent's creature when you sacrifice an artifact, because once this flips, you do have to re-equip it because it leaves play. I think it's going to be rather good, especially on a budget, and otherwise just very good in general. So this is a really easy recommendation, and I would recommend this for a lot of different kinds of decks. Likewise, Enterprising Scallywag is a card that always catches my eye, from dedicated like treasure decks to any form of Descend, Red Reanimator, anything that puts rummaging, looting, and the like into your graveyard. This is going to be a card you're rather happy with it. I will say, generally, if you can trigger this twice at all regularly, you're going to be happy with this. But if you're playing a deck that struggles to loot, doesn't use like any form of fetch lands, even the really cheap ones such as the ones from New Capenna or the new MH3 ones even. If you're not using any of those, then this isn't a very good card. But if you can find yourself regularly descending twice and getting this effect 2 times, that'll basically pay for itself and you'll be very happy. Remember, even 1 descend is a ramp for the next turn. Going from 2 mana to 4 mana is very reasonable, and if you can manage to do it through blocks or attacks or sacrificing something, you're going to be very happy. Do remember the text here that says card. Treasure tokens will not descend because though they are permanents that go to your graveyard, they are not cards, they are tokens. Moving into our multicolor, I have 2 here, both of which that really catch my eye. Now, Captain Storm and the next one are both legendary creatures, which means you can use them as your commander. And for certain people, when they build budget decks, what that sometimes means is that they do not count the commander. I know this is up in the air and people like just assume their way is the correct way. I just wanted to point it out. Some people are very happy being like, I'm playing, I don't know, like Kalia the Vast budget. And the budget comes from the rest of the deck and ignores Kalia the Vast. Is Kalia the Vast even worth anything anymore? Maybe that's not the case, but I don't know, she came to mind. If you want to build your deck completely on a budget and include your commander, Captain Storm is a really, really cool one to start with. There's a lot of really neat cheap pirates, such as this one, that you can get to start the deck going, and then the rest of the deck can just generally be an artifact deck. Remember, this is whenever an artifact you control enters, put a +1/+1 counter on target pirate you control. This doesn't say non-token, which I think is very, very important to point out. And with a few token generators and other ways to kind of get a bunch of artifacts in play, I think you'll find yourself putting quite a bit of tokens onto your pirates, or counters onto your pirates very, very quickly. If you're going to play with Captain Storm being the only pirate, which is something you can do, you can build a pretty cheap Voltron deck. If you're looking at a few different pirates, I think you'll have a better time, but still, the ability on a good turn to put like 3 to 4 +1/+1 counters onto your creatures while developing the rest of your game plan, because those artifacts do something, is going to be really good for you, I think, and a really fun budget commander. On the other hand, Zoyowa is a card that just infinitely catches my imagination, not just because it has black, but generally because it has black into it. This is a very good pressure card. It's in my Xantia deck right now, and if I find other decks, I think it's going to be in my Olivia Mercenary, Outlaw, in my Olivia Outlaw deck as well. The ability that when you descend on your turn, each opponent is basically put into a choice of either discarding, sacrificing, or taking 3 damage. Though none of these options are particularly dangerous in a 40 life format, this does add up. If you have this along with other pressure, such as a lot of like burglar rat style abilities or pings or other turn-by-turn damage, Zoyowa's kind of presence is going to add up a lot in the long run. Once again, much like our other goblin, you gotta make sure you have ways to descend regularly. Zoyowa, obviously, if they're your commander, you're gonna build around it, but if they are not your commander, still make sure you can generally descend. Obviously, you don't need to descend. Actually, it's the same thing. Yeah, you want to descend at least twice, I think, for this card to be worthwhile. And once again, if they're your commander, that's not going to be a problem. But if they're not, consider that before you put them in. All right, we're getting to the commander cards from the Ixalan commander set. There's a few here that really catch my eye, but we'll go through them rather quickly. Ore-Rich Stalactite is really cool, especially if you're building, well, I say especially, but almost exclusively if you're building Spellslinger, but if you're building budget Spellslinger. This can replace a Mana Rock really, really easily. It comes in untapped, which is rather good, and immediately can tap for, let's say, a Lightning Bolt or a Lava Dart, or I don't know what the kids play these days, I don't spell sling. But when you use that craft, you get the other side, which is an artifact that allows you to cast those 4 cards one at a time. Oh no, you don't have to, yeah, okay. Sorry, I momentarily thought that you could, when you cast it, yeah, you can, okay. You can only cast each card once, because once you cast that card, it will go into your graveyard after the fact. But up until then, you can use the Cosmium Catalyst 4 times if you just use 4, because it's 4 or more, to get those abilities. Now, for me, generally, because it's random, I would like to use 4 of them, because then we can kind of guarantee the good hits. But if you're playing like a really, really slow game, you're ultra budget, it probably doesn't hurt to put 6 to 10 cards underneath this and just slowly make your way through, not even including the fact that if you have untap abilities, this card gets much, much better. I think generally, this is a very decent card in Spellslinger. Do note that the cards you exile have to be red, so keep that in mind for the deck you put this in, but if you are in a mainly red Spellslinger deck, which I think is generally the correct choice, this is a very good addition. In white, Redemption Choir really caught my eye as a very, very interesting Titan-style card. Of course, when I say Titan, I mean a card that has a trigger on ETB and attack. So, what does this card do? It's a 3/3 lifelink with Coven, and so on ETB or attack, if you have Coven, which is controlling 3 or more creatures with different powers, return target permanent card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So if you have the right setup, this is Sun Titan, 2 mana less. Now you might say, well, Cursed, isn't Coven a difficult setup to have? And I would argue, not really, because this is a creature. I'm going to give you an example. I've been playing in Modern on and off the Hideaway, Mono-White Hideaway deck, which uses one of the cards from the Heist, where it is a similar Coven enabler, where you need Coven for the trigger to happen, but it is an artifact and not a creature itself. And I find being able to get Coven is almost entirely dependent on just having 3 creatures. And that's in a one-on-one format where my opponents know that if I get that Coven and I activate that artifact, I get an Emrakul. So they're very, very keen on stopping me. In a 4-player format where you can put this in a major, like mainly creature-built deck, if you know your commander is not a 3-power creature, you already have 2 cards on the way to getting Coven. You have a third, and you're in the money. You know, you have a 1/2 and a 2/2, you slam Redemption Choir, you immediately reanimate a permanent mana value 3 or less, which means very specifically lands count, which is very, very good. So Redemption Choir I think is really, really good, and I think is being slept on a little bit. Moving forward, I think we're coming to the end. Last few cards, Bygone Marvels is one that also really caught my eye for both budget and ultra budget. This is green to return target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. But if you have Descend 8, you get 3 cards back for green. Once again, obviously do not just put this into any green deck, but any green deck that has a graveyard theme. I'm thinking black-green, blue-green with Loot, red-green with Rummage. You're going to be able to fill out your graveyard with permanents really, really rather good. And then if you can cast this with Descend 8, you are basically drawing 3 for 2 mana, which is particularly powerful. Any form of like land or land sacrifice deck will have this work really, really easily, but of course the ceiling is lower because you can't just slam those lands back onto the battlefield. However, if you think of like a green-black self-mill deck or a blue-green self-mill deck, you should be able to trigger this rather easily. Very cool card. Very surprised that I haven't seen it once in a game of Commander when it has such an easy to attain and high ceiling. Still, I think this is something worth looking into. Finally, our last card is Order of the Sacred Dusk. Much like our last vampire card, and I didn't mention this before, our last vampire card is very much so built for any kind of deck, whereas Order of the Sacred Dusk is built to be specifically for vampire decks. I think both of these can be played outside of this. And just in decks of ultra budget decks of their color. Order of the Sacred Dusk, yeah, you might say we're missing that last piece of text, but how often in ultra budget do you have access to a 5/5 flying lifelink haste in white-black that can be, you know, potentially free or as cheap, like reliably cheap as like what, 3, 2, 4 mana? Probably you wouldn't cast this unless you can cast it for 3 or less, but still, That's really good. That's not even including if it attacks alone, it's a 6/6 flying lifelink haste. I think that's good enough, especially in ultra budget. That's a huge life swing. Now, let's say you're not in just any form of black-white deck. What if you are in vampires? All of a sudden, Order of the Sacred Dusk gets really, really good because then you have one vampire already. Sorry, brain stop. If you have like 4 vampires, which I think is reasonable, this attacks for 10. Right? You have, with this, 5 vampires, each of them have Exalted now. This attacks for 10 lifelink haste damage. That's not even including how good this card gets if you can clone it, for example, because then all of a sudden you are adding just another torrent of Exalted triggers. Exalted is a very good mechanic, but it is often on very bad cards, and this is not one of them. So if you are at all in, especially in ultra budget or somewhat budget, and you're looking for a finisher in your like vampire deck, your knight deck, or just in your black-white aggro deck, this is a very good one. I also really, really like that the horses are also vampires. All right, with that, that comes to an end of the budget cards that really caught my eye. But as you know, I am not omnipotent, nor am I omniscient. I think I meant omniscient. I don't know all the cards in here, and I probably missed some of your favorite budget cards. Please comment below if you can of which budget cards you really, really like, or if you hate the cards I picked, let me know in the nicest way you can. Thank you so much, everyone. Good luck and happy deck building. Thank you so much for watching. This video is brought to you by viewers like you and people on my Patreon. If you'd like to send me another draft of this deck, or any deck, there is a link in the video description down below. And if you'd like to make your deck one of my donation decks I work on, there's a link there too. Finally, if you'd like to like, comment, subscribe, I would be very appreciative. It helps the channel quite a bit. Thank you and good luck in brewing and building.